was a cold, rainy night. The rain had been falling all day, turning the ground into slippery mud. Lightning flashed in the sky, followed by loud thunder that made the windows of the small car shake. Sarah was driving alone on an empty road. Her windshield wipers worked hard, but the rain was so heavy she could barely see 10 feet ahead. She hated driving at night, especially in weather like this. The GPS on her phone was glitchy, and the roads were unfamiliar. Sarah was on her way to a weekend retreat with her friends, but she had taken a wrong turn miles back. Now she was completely lost in the middle of nowhere. Her phone had no signal, and the battery was almost dead. She cursed under her breath. The gas tank was nearly empty too. Panic began to creep into her mind. After driving for another 10 minutes, she saw a dim light in the distance. It looked like a house. "Thank God," she whispered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Sarah parked her car on the muddy driveway leading up to the house. It was an old 2-story structure with peeling paint and broken shutters. The light she had seen came from a single bulb. The house looked abandoned, but someone must live here, she thought. Who else would keep the light on? And she holding her coat over her head to shield herself from the rain. As she approached the house, the wooden porch creaked under her feet. She hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. Knock, knock, knock. There was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time. It creaked open on its own. "Hello," Sarah called out, her voice shaky. The hallway inside was dimly lit, with old furniture covered in dust. The smell of mildew hit her nose. "Is anyone here? I need help," she shouted again. Still no answer. But then, she heard it, a faint sound coming from upstairs. It was soft at first, like whispering, but it grew louder, turning into what sounded like a child's laughter. She thought about leaving, but the rain outside was getting worse. She stepped inside, hoping to find someone who could help. "Hello?" she called out one more time, her voice trembling. As she walked down the hallway, she noticed family portraits on the walls. The photos were faded, showing a family of 4, a man, a woman, a boy, and a little girl. Their faces looked serious, almost too serious, as if they didn't want to be photographed. Suddenly, a voice came from behind her. "You shouldn't be here." And saw an old man standing in the shadows near the staircase. His clothes were dirty, and his face was thin and pale. He stared at her with wide, unblinking eyes. "I'm sorry," Sarah stammered. "I didn't mean to intrude. My car is almost out of gas, and I got lost in the storm. Can I use your phone?" The old man shook his head slowly. "No phones here. You need to leave. Now." "But," he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. Before Sarah could respond, she heard the child's laughter again, this time coming from upstairs. The old man's face twisted in fear. "They're awake," he whispered. Sarah took a step back. "Who's awake?" she asked. The old man didn't answer. He just muttered under his breath. "They don't like strangers. They don't like anyone." Ignoring his warning, Sarah turned toward the staircase. She needed answers, and if there were children upstairs, they might be able to help her. "Wait!" the old man yelled, but Sarah was already climbing the stairs. The laughter grew louder as she reached the top. The upstairs hallway was lined with more doors, all of them slightly open. A faint light flickered from one of the rooms. "Hello? Is anyone here?" she called out. She peeked into the room with the light. It looked like a child's bedroom. There were toys scattered across the floor, a small bed in the corner, and drawings pinned to the walls. But something about the drawings made her shiver. They were crude, done in crayon, and all showed the same thing, a dark figure standing over a... Suddenly, Sarah heard a loud thud from behind her. She turned quickly and saw 2 small children standing in the hallway, a boy and a girl, both pale with dark hair and wide, unblinking eyes. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The children didn't answer. They just stared at her. Then the girl smiled, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. Before Sarah could scream, the boy spoke. "Do you want to play a game?" His voice was high-pitched and unnatural, like nails on a chalk. No, Sarah whispered, stepping back. The girl giggled. "You don't have a choice." The hallway began to change. The walls darkened, and the air grew cold. Shadows moved on their own, creeping along the floor like living things. The boy held up a small blood-stained doll. "Find her," he said. Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. The children didn't answer. Instead, they vanished, leaving Sarah alone in the dark hallway. Panicking, Sarah ran back toward the stairs, but the staircase was gone. In its place was a long, endless hallway. Doors slammed shut around her, and the sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She turned around and saw the dark figure from the drawings. It was tall, with long, bony limbs and glowing red eyes. It moved slowly but deliberately, its footsteps heavy. Sarah ran, throwing open one door after another, but every room looked the same, empty and cold, with the same crude drawings on the walls. The children's laughter echoed all around her. "You can't leave," they taunted. "You're ours now." After what felt like hours of running, Sarah found herself back in the child's bedroom. The toys were gone, replaced by old, rotting furniture. A broken mirror hung on the wall, and in its reflection, Sarah saw the dark figure standing behind her. She turned quickly, but no one was there. On the floor, she saw the bloodstained doll the boy had been holding. She picked it up, hoping it might be a clue. Suddenly, the old man's voice echoed in her mind. "They don't like strangers." Sarah realized the truth. The house wasn't normal. It was a trap, a place where lost souls were lured in and never allowed to leave. The children weren't children at all. They were something else, something evil. Desperate, Sarah clutched the doll and, "I want to leave. Please, let me go." The laughter stopped. For a moment, the house was silent. Then the floor beneath her began to shake. The dark figure appeared again, its red eyes glowing brighter than ever. It reached for her, its long fingers inches from her face. Sarah closed her eyes and screamed. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her car. The rain was still falling, but the house was gone. She was parked on an empty stretch of road, her gas tank full, and her phone battery somehow at 100%. Shaking, she started the car and drove away as fast as she could. Sarah never told anyone what happened that night, but sometimes when she's alone in the dark, she hears it, the sound of children laughing, faint and distant, as if they're calling her back. Months passed after Sarah's horrifying encounter. She had tried to forget the incident, convincing herself it was just a bad dream caused by exhaustion and the storm. But strange things began happening that she couldn't ignore. At first, it was small things, lights flickering in her apartment, toys she didn't own appearing in odd places, and that faint, haunting sound of laughter at night. She brushed it off as her imagination until the voices started. "Find us," they whispered in her ear when she was alone. "Come back." The voice was always the same, the high-pitched, unnatural tone of the boy from the house. Each time she heard it, she froze in terror. She would check her phone, her closets, and even under the bed, but no one was ever there. Yet the feeling of being watched never left her. She tried to tell her friends, but they laughed it off. "Sarah, you've just been under a lot of stress," her best friend Jenna said. "You've been talking about that stormy night for months now. Let it go." But Sarah couldn't let it go. Every night the whispers grew louder, and the strange occurrences more frequent. Pictures fell from walls. Her television turned on by itself, and once she woke up to find muddy footprints leading from her front door to her bed. She began to wonder, had she truly escaped the house that night, or had something followed her? Desperate for an explanation, Sarah started researching the area where the old house had been. She combed through library archives, online forums, and even visited local historians. The deeper she dug, the darker the story. She discovered that the house was infamous in the region, though most people dismissed it as a legend. Decades ago, it had belonged to a man named Edward Hale, a widower who lived there with his 2 children, Thomas and Lila. But one stormy night, just like the one Sarah had endured, the family vanished without a trace. The house stood abandoned for years until locals began reporting strange sightings, flickering lights in the windows, children's laughter in the woods, and the silhouette of a tall, dark figure pacing the halls. People who entered the house were said to disappear, leaving behind only whispers of what they'd seen. Sarah's blood ran cold. The story matched her experience perfectly. She found an old black and white photo of Edward Hale's family and gasped. The children in the photo were the same ones she had seen in the house. Their wide eyes stared back at her from the grainy image, their faces devoid of emotion. Free from whatever was haunting her, Sarah visited a local medium, a woman named Eleanor who was known for helping people deal with restless spirits. Eleanor listened quietly as Sarah recounted her story, her face growing more serious with each detail. When Sarah finished, Eleanor leaned back in her chair and sighed. "You've been marked," she said. "Marked? What does that mean?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "It's haunted. It's cursed. The spirits there are trapped, unable to leave. They lure people in, hoping to escape by attaching themselves to someone. But it's not the children you should fear. It's him." Sarah's mind flashed back to the dark figure with glowing red eyes. "The tall man?" Eleanor nodded. "He's not a man. He's something older, something evil. He controls the house and he's bound to it. But now he's bound to you too." "What can I do?" Sarah pleaded. "How do I stop this?" Eleanor hesitated. "You have to go back." The idea of returning to the house terrified Sarah, but she had no choice. Eleanor gave her a small pouch filled with herbs and told her to scatter it in every room of the house. "It will weaken his hold," she explained. "But you must act quickly. If he catches you, there's no coming back." Sarah drove back to the location where she had first encountered the house. The storm was just as fierce as before, with rain pelting her windshield and thunder shaking the ground. When she arrived, the house was there, just as she remembered it, old, broken, and terrifying. She stepped inside, clutching the pouch tightly. The air inside was heavy and cold, and the laughter of the children echoed from the walls. "You came back," the girl's voice said, mocking her. "Good. We missed you." Sarah ignored them and began scattering the herbs in the hallway, muttering the incantation Eleanor had taught her. The house groaned as if it were alive, and the shadows on the walls began to writhe. As Sarah reached the staircase, the dark figure appeared at the top, its glowing red eyes fixed on her. "You shouldn't have come back," it growled, its voice deep and menacing. Sarah's hand shook, but she forced herself to keep moving. She threw a handful of herbs at the figure and it recoiled, hissing in pain. The children's laughter turned into screams, and the walls began to crack. "Leave now," the boy's voice shrieked. "You can't save yourself." But Sarah didn't stop. She moved from room to room, scattering the herbs and chanting the incantation. The house trembled, and the dark figure grew weaker, its form flickering like a dying flame. Sarah reached the child's bedroom, the last room. She scattered the remaining herbs and shouted the final words of the incantation. The house let out a deafening roar, and the dark figure lunged at her, its bony fingers inches from her throat. There was a blinding flash of light, and everything went silent. When Sarah opened her eyes, she was standing outside in the rain. The house was gone. In its place was an empty, muddy field. The air was still, and the oppressive weight she had felt for months was lifted. She checked her phone. It had full signal. She quickly called her best friend, sobbing into the phone as she tried to explain what had happened. Jenna didn't understand but promised to come pick her up. As Sarah waited by the roadside, she felt a sense of peace for the first time in months. The children's laughter was gone, and the shadows no longer haunted her. She knew the house was finally destroyed, and its dark occupants were gone for good. Or so she thought. Weeks later, Sarah was cleaning her apartment when she found something under her bed, a small blood-stained doll. Her heart stopped as a familiar voice echoed in her mind. "Did you really think you could escape?" The lights flickered, and somewhere in the darkness, a child began to laugh. Sarah froze, staring at the blood-stained doll in her trembling hands. The familiar sound of the laughter sent chills down her spine. Her mind raced, trying to understand what had gone wrong. She had destroyed the house. The ritual was supposed to work. "Leave me alone," she screamed, throwing the doll across the room. It hit the wall and fell to the floor, but the laughter only grew louder. The sound seemed to echo from every corner of her apartment, growing more twisted and distorted. Sarah grabbed her phone and tried calling Eleanor, the medium who had helped her. The line rang twice before cutting off. She tried again, but this time, a child's voice answered. "Hello, Sarah," it said, giggling. She dropped the phone and, desperate for answers, Sarah drove straight to Eleanor's house. The streets were eerily quiet, and the rain had started again, falling in a light drizzle. When she arrived, she pounded on the door, shouting Eleanor's name. After a moment, the door creaked open. Eleanor stood there, looking pale and shaken. "You're not supposed to be here," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean? You told me to do the ritual. I did everything you said," Sarah cried. Eleanor's eyes darted around nervously. "Come inside," she said, pulling Sarah in and locking the door behind her. Inside, Eleanor's house was filled with strange items, jars of herbs, candles, and old books with symbols Sarah didn't recognize. Eleanor motioned for Sarah to sit down. "What happened?" Sarah demanded. Eleanor sighed heavily. "The house may be gone, but its curse isn't. That thing, the tall man, he's not bound to the house alone. He's bound to whoever he marks. And now, he's bound to you." Sarah felt her heart sink. "So what am I supposed to do? Live like this forever?" Eleanor shook her head. "There is one way to end it, but it's dangerous. You have to confront him on his terms." "His terms?" Eleanor opened an old book and flipped to a page covered in strange symbols. She pointed to an illustration of a tall, shadowy figure surrounded by a circle of flames. "The tall man thrives on fear and suffering. He traps his victims in endless cycles of torment. But there's a way to break the cycle. You must draw him out and destroy his connection to this world. To do that, you'll need to enter his realm." "His realm?" Sarah's voice cracked. "How do I do that?" Eleanor handed her a small black candle. "Light this at midnight and focus on him. It will open the doorway. But be warned, once you're in his realm, there's no guarantee you'll come back." That night, Sarah prepared herself. She cleared a space in her apartment and lit the black candle at exactly midnight. The flame burned an eerie blue, casting unnatural shadows on the walls. As she stared into the flame, she thought of the tall man, his glowing red eyes, and the children's laughter. The air around her grew cold, and the shadows began to stretch and twist. Suddenly, the room went dark. When Sarah opened her eyes, she was no longer in her apartment. She stood in a desolate, fog-covered forest. The trees were twisted and bare, their branches clawing at the sky. The only sound was the faint echo of children laughing in the distance. "Welcome, Sarah," a deep, menacing voice said. She turned and saw him, the tall man. He was even more terrifying in his realm, his form shifting and flickering like a shadow in a storm. His red eyes burned like fire, and his bony fingers reached out toward her. "You shouldn't have come here," he hissed. Sarah held her ground, clutching the pouch of herbs Eleanor had given her. She threw the contents at him, and the tall man let out a guttural roar as the herbs burned his shadowy form. "You can't win," he growled. "I am eternal." But Sarah didn't stop. She remembered the ritual Eleanor had taught her. She drew a circle in the dirt around herself and lit the second black candle she had brought. The flame flared brightly, creating a barrier between her and the tall man. He lunged at her, but the barrier held, forcing him back. The children's laughter turned into screams as the forest around them began to collapse. "This is your end," Sarah shouted, reciting the final words of the ritual. The tall man let out a deafening scream as his form disintegrated into ash. The ground beneath them split open, and he was pulled into the void, his screams fading into silence. Sarah woke up on her living room floor, the black candle burned down to nothing. The air was warm, and the oppressive feeling that had haunted her for months was gone. She looked around and saw that everything was as it should be. No shadows, no laughter, no blood-stained doll. For the first time in months, she felt free. Weeks later, Sarah returned to her normal life. She started going out with friends, picked up new hobbies, and even began sleeping through the night. But sometimes, when she was alone, she couldn't help but feel like something was watching her. One evening, as she was tidying up her apartment, she found something under her couch, a single crayon drawing of a tall, dark figure standing in the woods. And in the corner of the drawing, written in a child's handwriting, were the words, "See you soon." It was a cold, rainy night. Emily sat in her small car gripping the steering wheel tightly. She could barely see the road through the sheets of rain pouring down. The headlights reflected off the wet asphalt, creating a blurry, shimmering effect. Her GPS had lost signal miles ago, and the dark, winding roads stretched endlessly before her. She was on her way to visit her grandmother in the countryside, but the storm had thrown her off course. The gas gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, and her phone battery was nearly dead. Emily felt her chest tighten as she realized she was lost in the middle of nowhere. Lightning illuminating the trees on either side of the road. For a moment she thought she saw a figure standing among the trees, but it was gone as quickly as the light faded. She shook her head, chalking it up to her imagination. "Just keep driving," she whispered to herself. "There has to be a town or a gas station somewhere." But after another 20 minutes of driving, there was still nothing, only the endless rain and the dark forest pressing in around her. Just as Emily was about to give up and pull over, she saw it, a faint glow in the distance. Her heart leapt. It was a house, its windows glowing with warm yellow light. She turned onto a narrow, muddy driveway that led up to the house. It was an old 2-story structure with a steep roof and broken shutters. The paint was peeling, and the porch sagged under the weight of years. Still, it was the only sign of life she had seen for miles. Emily parked her car and grabbed her coat, holding it over her head as she ran through the rain to the front door. She knocked loudly, hoping someone inside could help. Knock, knock, knock. There was no answer. She knocked again, harder this time. The rain was pouring down her back, soaking her clothes. Finally, the door creaked open. "Hello?" she called out, stepping inside. The house was dark, except for a single lamp in the corner of the living room. The air smelled musty, like old wood and damp fabric. "Is anyone here?" Emily asked, her voice echoing. "I'm lost, and my car is almost out of gas. I just need directions or a phone." There was no response. But then she heard it, a faint sound coming from upstairs. It was soft, like a child's laughter. Emily hesitated. Something about the laughter sent a chill down her spine. But she told herself it was just a child, maybe playing upstairs. She decided to investigate. As she climbed the creaky staircase, the laughter grew louder. It echoed through the halls, playful and innocent. But there was no sign of a child. The hallway at the top of the stairs was lined with closed doors. "Hello?" Emily called out again. One of the doors creaked open, revealing a dimly lit bedroom. It looked like a child's room, with a small bed, a rocking horse, and shelves filled with dusty toys. On the floor was a teddy bear, its button eyes missing. Emily stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by the worn rug. She bent down to pick up the teddy bear, but as she touched it, the laughter stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, the door slammed shut behind her. Emily jumped to her feet and ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. She twisted the doorknob and pounded on the wood, but it was as if the door was sealed shut. "Let me out," she shouted, panic rising in her chest. The sound of footsteps echoed outside the room, slow and deliberate. Emily froze, her heart pounding. Someone or something was outside the door. "Who's there?" she demanded. The footsteps stopped. Then a voice, soft and childlike, whispered through the crack in the Do you want to play?" Emily backed away, shaking her head. "No, I don't want to play. Let me out," the voice giggled. Too late. The room began to change. The walls darkened, and the furniture warped, twisting into grotesque shapes. The teddy bear on the floor began to move, its head turning slowly to face her. Its buttonless eyes seemed to stare right into her soul. Emily grabbed a lamp from the bedside table and threw it at the door. The glass shattered, but the door remained intact. The room was growing colder, and shadows danced along the walls, taking on strange, human-like shapes. Desperate, Emily ran to the window and tried to open it, but it was stuck. She grabbed a chair and smashed it against the glass. The window shattered, and cold rain poured in. Without thinking, she climbed out onto the roof, the rain making the shingles slick beneath her feet. Below her was the muddy driveway and her car. It looked so far away. She climbed down carefully, her fingers gripping the edges of the roof. When she was close enough, she jumped, landing in the mud with a painful Emily ran to her car, her heart racing. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking. As she unlocked the door, she glanced back at the house. The front door was wide open, and a figure stood in the doorway. It was tall and thin, its face hidden in shadow. The figure began to move toward her, its steps slow but purposeful. Emily scrambled into the car and locked the doors. She turned the key in the ignition, praying the engine would start. It roared to life. She slammed the car into reverse, backing out of the driveway as fast as she could. The figure was still coming, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. Emily sped down the road, her tires skidding on the wet pavement. She didn't dare look back. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The rain seemed to grow heavier, and the road became harder to see, but she didn't care. She just wanted to get as far away from that house as possible. Suddenly, her headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was the same tall, shadowy figure from the house. She screamed and swerved, narrowly avoiding it. The car skidded off the road and into a ditch, the impact jarring her forward. Emily groaned, her head pounding. The car was stuck, the engine sputtering. She looked around, trying to gather her bearings. Then she saw them, children standing in the rain, their faces pale and expressionless. They surrounded the car, their wide eyes staring at her. "Why are you doing this?" Emily shouted, tears streaming down her face. The children didn't answer. Instead, they began to smile, their mouths stretching unnaturally wide. The tall figure appeared behind them, its glowing eyes locking onto hers. It raised a long, bony hand and pointed at her. Emily felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The car's engine roared to life on its own, and the vehicle began to move back toward the house. "No, no, please," she screamed, trying to stop the car, but the controls wouldn't respond. The house loomed ahead, its windows glowing eerily. The car came to a stop in front of the porch, and the engine died. Emily sat frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked at the front door, which was now wide open. The children stood in the doorway, their smiles gone. "Come play with us," they said in unison. Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, please, no." The tall figure stepped out of the shadows, its red eyes burning into hers. It reached out, and the world around her went dark. When Emily woke up, she was sitting in her car, parked on the same dark road. The rain was still falling, and the forest stretched endlessly on either side. Her gas tank was full, and her phone battery was charged. For a moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare. She saw it in her rearview mirror, the house, glowing faintly in the distance. And from the shadows, a child's voice whispered, "See you soon."